Mom can't keep the house. It's wasted on her now. My daughter-in-law's voice floated down the hallway, thin and sharp as the cold March air that still clung to my coat. I stopped with one sleeve halfway on. The closet door was open, the smell of old wool and cedar oil pressing around me, and for a second I wondered if I'd misheard her. But then she added, softer, like she knew she shouldn't be saying it at all. Once all this is done, we should talk to her before she forgets where she put the papers. I looked at my own hand, veiny and blotched, fingers steady as I smoothed the sleeve over my wrist. I wasn't supposed to be listening. They were in the kitchen, near the back window, where the snow outside our small Ohio yard had melted into gray patches of slush and dead grass. It was late March, the kind where the sunlight pretends to be warm, but the wind goes right through you. I live alone in this house now, the house my husband, Tom, put his life into, the house where we raised our 2 children, Mark and Emily, both of whom had been too busy to make it to their father's funeral this morning. And yet here was Mark in my kitchen now, his truck in the driveway, his wife, Lisa, rearranging my future with a few hushed sentences over cold coffee. The hallway felt longer than it was. I could see the little ceramic dish on the narrow table by the front door, the one with the chipped blue edge, and in it, my front door key lay where it always lay, brass dulled from my thumb rubbing over it 1,000 times. That key has been in the same spot for over 30 years, right under the small hook where Tom used to hang his work jacket, and I realized my fingers were itching to pick it up, to close around it like a small piece of spine. Instead, I reached for the scarf still looped on the hanger. The wool rasped against my neck when I settled it there, and I took a slow breath before stepping back into the hallway, making sure my footsteps were loud enough on the hardwood that no one could pretend they hadn't known I was close. The voices in the kitchen went silent. When I turned the corner, Mark was staring down at his phone, and Lisa was rinsing out mugs at the sink like they were doing me a favor by tidying up. The funeral home's white lilies sat on the table in a vase, their petals bowing, the fragrance thick and almost rotten already. I looked at the empty chairs around that table and tried not to see how many of them had been empty at the church this morning, too. "You're not leaving yet, are you?" Lisa asked, without turning fully around. I could see her profile in the window's reflection, the tight mouth, the eyebrows drawn together in that pinched way she gets when she's planning something. "I was just putting my coat away," I said. I heard my own voice, a little too composed. "Resting my feet for a minute." Mark glanced up at me then, his eyes red in the corners, but whether that was from grief or from lack of sleep, I couldn't tell. He has his father's shoulders, but not his father's hands. His fingers were thick, clumsy with the phone, and I remembered Tom's careful way of tightening a screw or tracing a line on a blueprint. "Mom," Mark said, sliding the phone face down on the table. "We were just talking about some practical stuff, for later." The word later landed in me like a stone in water. Everyone had said that all week. "We'll talk later. I'll call later. I'll visit later. Later, after the service. Later, when work slows down." Later never showed up at the funeral home this morning. Just me, the pastor, our elderly neighbor Margaret, and that poor young man from the funeral home, trying to look solemn while he adjusted the flowers on a casket only 3 people would stand beside. Emily had called from Chicago with the sound of clinking glasses and laughter behind her. "Mom, I'm so sorry. They changed the dates on this conference. It's a huge opportunity, and flights were insane. I swear I tried. She cried, but the music in the background was too cheerful, some pop song with a driving beat, and I had thanked her for the flowers she'd had delivered instead. Mark had texted first. A text. My son sent me a message with blue bubbles to tell me he wasn't going to his father's funeral. "We're buried at the hospital," he'd written. "Double shift and we're short-staffed, Mom. If I could split myself in two, I would." He came by the house now, though, for practical stuff. "We can handle practical later," I said, moving toward the little key dish almost without thinking, my fingers brushing the cool rim. I felt the faint ridge where the ceramic had chipped years ago when Tom dropped his keys in too hard after hearing that the factory was cutting hours. "Sit with me for a bit. That's all I need." Today. Lisa dried her hands and turned, a paper towel twisted tight between her fingers. "We just think it's better to start sooner rather than later," she said. "These things drag on, and it can get messy. Your house, the paperwork, the will, the accounts. It's a lot for you by yourself." The way she said "your house" made something stiffen in my chest, like the house had already moved into a category of problems that needed solving. "I've been paying the bills for quite some time," I said, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "Your father wasn't much help with the computer." That was true. Tom did numbers on paper, lists in his notebook, not in apps and online accounts. He'd kept a dog-eared ledger in the desk drawer with every check recorded in his neat block letters. Lisa smiled with her mouth, not her eyes. "Of course," she said, and there was a little too much patience in it. "You've done great. We just want to make sure you don't get taken advantage of. You hear all these stories, seniors and scams." Mark cleared his throat. "We're just thinking about options," he said. "The house is big, Mom. It's a lot to maintain. Roof, furnace, snow, you know." I looked at the window. Outside, the patchy snow in our small backyard was crusted with dirt, the chain-link fence casting a crooked shadow. A cardinal hopped on one of the bare branches, a splash of red against all that gray. Tom had hung the bird feeder there himself, standing on the back step, whistling while he measured where it would go. "Your father managed," I said quietly. "Even when his back was acting up, he didn't like to admit he needed help. But we got through." I could almost hear Tom's voice in my ear, the way he'd said, "We'll do what we always do, Ellen, one thing at a time." That was in the hospital, when the doctor with the tired eyes had talked about options too. Except back then, the options weren't about houses. They were about chemo and radiation and clinical trials that sounded like science fiction. The doctor had leaned forward and said, "Think of it like choosing between long, rough roads or shorter, gentler ones. They all end in the same place, but you can decide how you travel there." His voice had been kind, and I had clung to it like a rail. Tom had chosen the shorter road. He'd said he didn't want to spend whatever time he had left being poked and poisoned. "I want to be home," he'd told me, fingers curling around mine in the quiet hospital room. "I want to sit in my chair and listen to the old clock and complain about the recipes on TV shows. If that's all I get, it's enough." The old clock. I could hear it now in the living room, through the thin wall, its soft tick, 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 counting each second like beads on a necklace. We bought that wall clock the summer after we moved in, when our hair was still dark and our backs didn't ache when we carried laundry up the stairs. It had a pendulum that swung like a heartbeat. I've set my days by that clock for decades. It struck 12 this morning in an empty house while I stood in front of the mirror in my black dress, pinning on the silver brooch Tom gave me on our 20th anniversary. I'd watched my reflection, the lines on my face, the way grief had carved new ones overnight. No children bustling in, asking where their ties were, no grandchildren's feet pounding on the stairs, just me and the clock, and the sound of the funeral director's car pulling into the driveway right on time. Now, that same clock ticked in the background while my son assessed my house like it was a project on a list. "We're not saying you can't manage," Mark said, but the way he held his hands out, palms up, felt like he was trying to calm a child. "You've been amazing with Dad. It's just, I see a lot at the hospital. People your age living alone, having falls. We don't want that for you." Lisa jumped in, eager. "There's that nice community over in Westfield," she said. "Independent living, but with support. Remember, Mark's co-worker's mom is there. They have game nights and a shuttle and everything. And they buy your house for you. Isn't that how it works, Mark?" The words "buy your house" landed with a thud. "It's more complicated than that," Mark muttered, shooting her a look. But the damage was done. I imagined some faceless company writing a check for this place. For the kitchen, Tom painted that buttery yellow because he said it made winter less gloomy. For the dent in the hallway, where Mark had rammed his toy truck into the wall so hard it chipped the plaster. For the notch in the door frame where we'd marked Emily's height each birthday, until she turned 13 and declared she was too old for that. I looked down at my hand again, still resting on the ceramic dish, fingers inches from the key. I picked it up finally. The metal felt heavier than it used to, or maybe my bones were just thinner around it. "I didn't know we were having a meeting today," I said. My voice came out softer than I'd planned, but there was a firmness under it even I could hear. "I thought my husband had just been buried, and my family was coming over for coffee." Mark winced. I saw it, that little flinch he gets when he realizes he's pushed too hard at work or said the wrong thing to Lisa. "We're sorry, Mom," he murmured. "It's just, time moves, you know. Things pile up. I figured since I was here." Since he was here. He couldn't take a half day to say goodbye at the church, but he could stop by afterward to make plans about my house. I pressed the key into my palm until its ridges bit my skin. "Did you talk to Emily about all this?" I asked. The question surprised me as it left my mouth. Emily, with her curated Chicago life and her all-black outfits and her lectures about mindfulness whenever I'm too negative. "We texted," Lisa said quickly. "She agrees the house is a lot. She said she just wants you to be safe and comfortable." "Is that what she said, or what you said she said?" I asked. I didn't mean it to sound as sharp as it did, but some days grief doesn't leave much room for politeness. Lisa's cheeks colored just a little. "We're all on the same team here," she said. "We love Tom, too." I thought of Emily's flowers at the funeral home. The card had been perfectly written, of course. "Your spirit lives on in every sunrise," something like that. But the vase had sat on a side table, and every time I looked at it, all I could see was her absence. Love is not the same as presence. It's not the same as standing next to your mother while she watches them lower her husband of 51 years into the ground. The thing about teams, I said, easing myself into the chair closest to the clock's ticking, is that sometimes one person ends up doing all the heavy lifting while everyone else yells instructions from the sidelines. Mark sighed. Mom, don't mom me like I'm being unreasonable, I replied. And I surprised myself again with how steady I sounded. I'd always been the one smoothing things over, patting arms, saying, "He didn't mean it like that," or "She's just tired." Tom was the one who spoke with his eyebrows, with his hands on his hips. I'd learned to be the cushion between him and the world. Now there was no one between me and our children, just me. Me and the clock and this key in my hand. For a moment, no one spoke. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing on the wet street. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and then stopped. I could feel grief sitting beside me like an invisible guest, its weight pressing on the seat cushion, tugging at my shoulders. But underneath it, threaded through like a different kind of ache, was something else. A flicker of anger, but not wild and sharp. It was slow, like coals. "I know you see a lot at the hospital," I said to Mark. "I know you worry. I'm glad you worry. It means you still think about me on those double shifts." His eyes softened at that. And for a second, he looked like the little boy who used to trail after Tom with a plastic hammer, begging for nails to help build things. "But," I went on, "this house is not a problem to solve today. Not like a broken leg you can set or a medicine you can prescribe. This house is—" I looked around the kitchen, at the old cabinets we'd never gotten around to replacing, at the linoleum floor with the faded pattern, at the side door where Tom used to kick his boots against the mat in winter, snow flying everywhere. "It's my life," I finished quietly, "and I need a moment to miss the man who filled it before we start deciding where it goes next." Lisa looked at the floor, then at Mark, then back at me. I could see the conflict in her. She isn't cruel, she's efficient. She makes lists and sticks to them. She grew up with a mother who kept everything spotless and always planned 5 steps ahead. I know this because Lisa told me once, halfway through a Thanksgiving dinner, after a second glass of wine loosened her tongue. "My mom never stopped to sit down," she'd said, laughing. "She'd clean your plate while you were still chewing. She thinks moving me, selling the house, would be like clearing a plate, wiping crumbs, tidying up a loose end." "Of course," Lisa said now, the paper towel twisted nearly in half. "We didn't mean, we're just trying to help. We can talk more in a few weeks." I nodded. "A few weeks," I repeated, and my hand loosened around the key. I turned it over, tracing the grooves with my thumb. A quiet settled, not comfortable, but not hostile either. A truce on thin ice. "Do you want me to make more coffee?" Lisa asked after a moment, defaulting to her safe topic. "I can start a fresh pot." "No, thank you," I said. "The pastor's visit wore me out. I think I'll just sit a while." The pastor had come by after the burial, still in his dark suit, smelling faintly of incense and snow. He'd sat in the chair across from me in the living room, the one nearest the clock, and talked about Tom's faith as if it were something that could be packed into a sermon and tied with a bow. He meant well. At the door, he'd said, "These first days are like walking through your house in the dark, Ellen. You'll bump into things you know are there, but you'll forget where they are. Little by little, your eyes adjust." I had nodded while the clock ticked between us. Now, in the kitchen, I heard it too, that steady sound. Time, adjusting my eyes whether I wanted it to or not. We can stay a bit, help tidy up, Mark offered. Take out the trash, do dishes, whatever. You both have work tomorrow, I reminded him, and the kids will need dinner. My grandchildren, they had not come to the funeral either. Soccer practice, a birthday party, a school project, small lives filling their days with immediate things. I did not blame them. Children don't understand the way a funeral wraps a life closed. To them, Granddad was already a voice on a screen the last few years. FaceTime calls while they held up art projects and trophies. He was never the man standing at the fence, calling them in for supper, the way he'd done with their father and aunt. Let me sit with the quiet tonight, I said. I need to hear what my house sounds like, without your father's cough in it. The words caught me by surprise, thickening in my throat. I hadn't realized how much that sound had been part of the background. Mark's eyes filled for the first time then, tears spilling over before he swiped them away quickly, like a boy again. Okay, he whispered. He stood and came around the table, and when he leaned down to hug me, his chin brushed the top of my head the way Tom's used to. His arms were strong but tentative, not quite sure how much pressure I could take. Call me if you need anything, Mom. I nodded against his chest. Drive safe, I murmured, because that's what mothers say, even when their sons are middle-aged men who save other people's lives for a living, but forget to stand at their own father's grave. When they left, the house exhaled. The front door clicked shut, the sound echoing down the hallway. I heard Lisa's voice outside, bright and practical, talking about traffic and getting gas on the way home. I walked, slowly, to the narrow table by the door and set my key back into its dish. The metal clicked softly against the ceramic, a familiar note. For the first time, I noticed that the hook where Tom's jacket used to hang was empty. I hadn't had the courage to take his coats down yet. They were still in the closet, heavy with his smell. But the hook itself stood bare, like a little question mark on the wall. In the living room, the clock ticked and ticked. I went to it, drawn like I always am, and laid my hand gently on its wooden frame. The grain felt smooth under my palm, worn by years of dusting. Just you and me now, I whispered, not sure if I meant Tom or the clock or myself. My fingers found the little door at the bottom, the one that hid the pendulum. I opened it and watched the brass disc swing back and forth, relentless and calm. That pendulum has seen Mark storm out the front door after fights, has swung while Emily stood in this very room, stuffing clothes into a suitcase, declaring she'd never come back to this small, suffocating town. It had ticked through every Christmas morning, every burnt roast, every late bill. It ticked today while my husband's coffin was lowered into the ground 3 miles away. I closed the little door gently and let my hand rest on the wood for another moment. In the silence, I thought of something Lisa had said in the hallway that she probably didn't think I heard the day before the funeral, when she thought I was upstairs resting. At least once we get the house sorted, she'd whispered to Mark, it'll be one less thing hanging over us. Hanging over them, my life, my memories, my seasons of sweeping these floors and stirring soup in this kitchen had become something heavy in the air that they needed to clear. I stood there, listening to the clock, and realized that as much as I ached for them to have been at the funeral, there was another ache now, too, a quieter one, but deeper. It was the ache of seeing my role in their lives tilt almost imperceptibly, from center to side, from home to obligation, from someone whose key they needed to someone whose key they wanted to take for safekeeping. My hand slipped into my cardigan pocket on instinct, and my fingers brushed against the cool shape of the spare key I'd forgotten was there. The one Tom insisted I carry whenever we went out together, just in case we lock ourselves out, hell. I curled my hand around it, feeling both keys now, one in the dish by the door, one hidden in my pocket. Two small pieces of metal, two versions of my future. I didn't know yet what I would do about the house, or the paperwork, or the gentle pressure I could feel gathering around me like snowdrifts. But as the clock ticked and the light outside the windows dimmed from gray to blue, I knew one thing with a clarity that surprised me. Whatever choices were coming, I would not make them half asleep, lulled by other people's versions of what was best for me. I straightened up, the ache in my back reminding me I was still very much alive, and walked to the front door again. With my hand on the key in the dish and the other on the key in my pocket, I stood for a long time between them, listening, not just to the old clock, but to something in myself I hadn't given much attention to in years, a small, stubborn voice that was suddenly, quietly, wide awake. I didn't move for a long time, just stood there with one hand on the cool little dish by the door and the other wrapped around the spare key in my pocket, listening to the old clock in the living room tick its steady way through what was left of the afternoon. And at some point I realized I was holding my breath, like if I breathed too deeply, something in this house would shift for good. So instead, I forced myself to do the most ordinary thing I could think of. I opened the front door and stepped out to check the mailbox, because grief or no grief, bills still arrive on time in Ohio, even in late March when the snow turns into dirty piles and the air smells like wet pavement and thawing yard. The little patch of grass in front of our house still more mud than green. The cold hit my cheeks, sharper than it had felt through the window, and I kept my cardigan tight with one hand while the other fit the key automatically into the lock when the door tried to drift closed behind me, my fingers knowing the motion before my mind caught up, a small comfort in a day where almost nothing else felt familiar. And the moment the door clicked, I thought of what Lisa had said earlier. Before she forgets where she put the papers, like my brain was already halfway gone, and they were just waiting for the proof. The thought stung more than the wind as I walked down the few concrete steps, the railing cold under my palm, and crossed to the mailbox on its crooked post by the sidewalk, the same one Tom always said he'd fix when the weather warms up, a promise he repeated every spring and somehow never quite got to, and now he never would. Inside, the usual chaos of envelopes waited for me, some white, some bright and cheerful with advertisement colors, all stuffed together like they didn't care that today was not a day for catalogs and coupons. And on top of the pile sat a long, slim envelope with the return address of the funeral home printed in tidy blue letters, which made my stomach clench, because I wasn't ready for whatever was inside that yet, not when the scent of their lilies was still lingering in my kitchen. So I used the bank statement envelope underneath as a shield and walked back up the steps, the key warm in my pocket from my grip, the sky the kind of dull, washed-out blue that promised another cold night. I was just closing the door behind me when I saw movement through the glass on the side, and there was Margaret from next door, crossing the slushy patch of yard between our houses with a covered dish in her gloved hands, her gray coat buttoned wrong, one side higher than the other, like she'd dressed in a hurry, and behind her our shared maple tree stood bare and spindly, its branches threaded against the sky. I opened the door again before she could knock, and she looked at me with those soft brown eyes of hers, full of something between pity and fierce loyalty, and said, a little out of breath, "I brought you that chicken casserole recipe your Tom always pretended he didn't like and then ate half the pan." And just like that, my throat burned, because there it was, his name, spoken openly in the doorway, not lowered like a topic we were already supposed to file away. "Come in," I managed, stepping aside, the familiar words sounding different now that they were for just me and not for us. And Margaret stamped her boots gently on the mat, careful as always, her gaze flicking to the key dish on the little table beside the door, the empty hook above it, and then to my face, and she gave me a small, knowing nod that said she'd noticed the absence the way I had, even if neither of us named it out loud. The smell of the casserole reached me as we walked back toward the kitchen, creamy and comforting, something with thyme maybe, and my stomach reminded me I'd eaten nothing but toast and coffee all day, my grief stubborn but not strong enough to keep hunger away forever. And the clock in the living room chimed 4 as we passed, its sound fuller than it had felt earlier, like it was greeting her, or maybe reminding me that time, rude thing that it is, does not pause just because we want to sit down in the doorway and refuse to move. We put the casserole on the counter, and Margaret fussed with the foil, her fingers a little clumsy in those cheap drugstore gloves she refused to replace because they still work, don't they? And after a second, she looked at me and said quietly, "He would have liked the service, dear," and I laughed once, a short, bitter little thing that surprised us both. "He would have liked a few more bodies in the pews, too," I said, more sharply than I meant to, and she pressed her lips together in that way she does when she's trying not to say something uncharitable and failing anyway, because... After a breath, she murmured, "Your Mark works too hard, I know, but there are some things you only do once in this life." And there it was, the line I'd been tiptoeing around in my mind all day, said out loud in my yellow kitchen under my tick-tick-ticking clock. I felt the words hang in the air between us, heavy and honest, and I didn't rush to defend my children this time, didn't jump in with excuses about conferences and double shifts, and the absence of those automatic words felt like another small death, one I wasn't sure whether to mourn or welcome. Instead, I pulled 2 mismatched plates from the cupboard and said, "Help me eat this, or I'll end up finishing the whole thing alone and hating both of us." And Margaret smiled, relieved to have something to do with her hands, and busied herself finding forks, like we were back in the years when Tom would wander in from the garage, hands black with grease, asking what smelled so good when the kids would complain about casserole night and then go back for seconds. We ate at the table under the vase of lilies, their overly sweet scent wrestling with the savory steam from the dish. And Margaret talked about the weather, about how the city needed to fix the potholes on Maple Avenue, about her grandson losing his first baby tooth, and how he'd insisted on writing the Tooth Fairy a thank you note, and I listened, grateful for the way her voice filled the spaces my thoughts kept falling into, until finally, when our plates were mostly empty and the light outside the window had shifted from gray to that purple blue that means evening is really here, she set down her fork and said, too casually, "My Denise has been after me to sell my place and move into some active living community by the highway. You know those things with the brochures full of tall, thin old people playing pickleball." And I felt my spine straighten just a little in my chair, because the way she said it, the half sneer on active, told me this was not just conversation for the sake of it. "What did you tell her?" I asked, though I could already guess, and Margaret snorted softly, folding her napkin in half, then in half again, her old rings catching the light. "I told her I'd miss my own kitchen too much," she said. "Told her it's one thing to have someone bring you a plate, but another to be the one choosing how much salt goes in the soup. She doesn't understand that yet. She will." The clock ticked in the next room, the distinct little tock at the end of each swing like an underline, and I thought of Lisa's brochure's idea of game nights and shuttles and everything, and how nowhere in her description had she mentioned the smell of a pot roast you've made 1,000 times, or the satisfaction of knowing exactly which drawer the potato masher is in without looking. Tom used to say the day he couldn't find his way to the coffee filters in the dark was the day we'd put him out to pasture, I said, and Margaret laughed, a sound that softened her whole face. "He always had a good line ready," she said fondly, and her eyes slid to the clock on the wall, the one visible from where we sat through the archway into the living room, its round face reflecting a little rectangle of fading light from the front window. "You keeping it wound, Ellen?" she asked. "Some people let the clocks wind down after—" She trailed off and made a small motion with her hand, a gesture that somehow encompassed funerals and casseroles and empty hooks by the door. "I wound it this morning," I answered, and for a moment pride flared in me, simple and clean. "Tom trained me before he got too weak, said, 'If I go first, Elle, don't let this house fall into silence.' He was very dramatic about it." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then don't," she said. "And don't let anyone else decide what silence looks like for you, either." She reached across the table and squeezed my wrist, her hand warm and papery, and then, because she is Margaret and knows when to leave a moment alone, she changed the subject, asking me if I'd seen the ridiculous hat Marjorie wore to church last Sunday, and we slid away from the heavy things for a while, letting the casserole and the ticking clock and the ordinary gossip stitch me back together just enough to get through the evening. After she left, with promises to pop by tomorrow if you don't mind, dear, the house grew quiet again, but it was a different quiet than earlier, less like a hollow and more like a deep breath. And I moved slowly through the rooms, turning on lamps, each little click of a light switch, another small declaration that I was still here, that this house was still mine tonight, regardless of brochures and options. Later, after I'd washed the dishes and put the leftover casserole in the fridge with a strip of masking tape labeled chicken, though there was no one here but me who needed the reminder, I sat in the living room in Tom's old chair, the one that had molded itself to his shape, and opened the stack of mail in my lap, the clock's steady presence over my shoulder, like a friend eavesdropping, its pendulum a little golden blur in the corner of my eye, reassuring and relentless at once. The funeral home envelope contained a polite thank you note and an itemized bill, the numbers marching down the page in neat black lines, and I traced each one with my finger, feeling the strange disconnect between the cost of a casket and the almost empty room it had stood in that morning. Next was the bank statement, pages of transactions printed on thin paper that rustled like tissue, and as I flipped through them, my phone vibrated on the side table, making me jump, the sound too loud in the quiet room. The caller ID showed Mark's name, and for a moment I considered letting it ring out, just to prove to myself that I could. But habit won, the old reflex of answering my children, and I snatched it up on the third ring. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice a little softer now, the edges rounded by something like guilt. "Just checking on you. How are you holding up?" I looked at the clock. Its hands pointed to 7:20, the minute hand inching forward. "I'm sitting in your father's chair reading about how expensive it is to die in Franklin County," I said dryly, and he huffed a small laugh. "Yeah," he said, "I see those bills at work. It's brutal." He hesitated then, and I could hear the background noise of his house, the murmur of television, the clatter of dishes, a child's high-pitched voice asking something. "Listen," he went on, "I scheduled a meeting for us at the bank for Thursday afternoon with one of their financial advisors. I thought it would be good to go over everything, accounts, the house, all that, just to make sure things are in order." The bank statement in my lap felt heavier. I turned a page without really seeing the numbers. "You scheduled it," I repeated, "without asking if I was free?" There was a tiny pause. "I figured you would be," he said carefully. "I blocked it for 3 p.m. so you don't have to worry about driving if you don't want to. I'll pick you up. They're really good there, Mom. They help a lot of older clients with transitions." The word transitions made my jaw clench. It sounded like something they used at the hospital, too, when they moved people from home to assisted living, from one stage of dependence to the next. "Mark," I said slowly, my eyes drifting to the clock's small brass pendulum swinging behind its glass door, the rhythm soothing and accusing at once. "I'll come, but you need to understand something. I am not a project for you to fit between doctor's rounds and hockey practice." "I know," he said quickly. "I know. This is just... I'm trying to help before things get overwhelming. It's easier to fix the roof when the sun's out than in the middle of a storm, right?" He sounded proud of that metaphor, like he'd been saving it, and I recognized it instantly as something he'd picked up from one of his colleagues, maybe something they tell families all the time in the ward. I let the analogy sit for a second, weighing it. "Fine," I said, "but I'm the one who decides when there's a storm." "Of course," he replied, a little too fast, relief obvious in the way his words tumbled. "I'll text you the details." After we hung up, I stayed in the chair, the phone still in my hand, the bank paper creased over my knees, and I let my eyes rest on the clock. The face was slightly yellowed with age, the black Roman numerals elegant and firm. And I remembered when Tom had installed it, how he'd stood on the step stool with his tongue peeking out between his teeth, in concentration, saying, "If this thing is even a hair crooked, it'll bother me till I die." And I'd laughed back then, telling him he was being dramatic. I listened to it now, measuring the empty spaces between each tick, and thought about Thursday, about being ushered into some glass-walled office by a cheerful stranger who would explain my life to me, using charts and metaphors, and I felt that little coal of anger inside me glow again, not enough to burn, but enough to warm my resolve. The next day crawled, and then it didn't. Grief has a way of warping time, so the morning stretched long and thin while I tried to untangle insurance letters and sympathy cards on the kitchen table. But then, suddenly, it was Thursday, and I was standing in front of the hall mirror again, wearing the same black slacks but a different sweater, a soft gray one Tom used to call my dove armor. He'd said I looked gentle in it, but also like I could fly away if I needed to. And behind me, in the mirror's reflection, the clock's face was visible through the archway, tiny but present, its hands pointing to 2:40, as if to say, "You still have time to change your mind." But when Mark's truck pulled into the driveway, right on the dot, my feet carried me to the front door anyway. I picked up my key from the dish without thinking, the brass cool and familiar, and slipped the spare one deeper into my pocket, a small private reassurance that no one else knew about. And when Mark opened the storm door and said, "Ready, Mom?" I forced a smile and nodded, letting him take the folder of papers from my hand, even though I wanted to keep it, the weight of my own information comforting. The bank in town had that smell all banks have, something between carpet cleaner and old pennies, and it was busy, the line at the teller snaking around one of those retractable rope stands, the chairs by the window full of people clutching deposit slips, and I felt small and large at the same time, a widow among errands, my private loss jostled alongside auto-pay disputes and mortgage applications. Mark steered me gently toward a little seating area where a young woman in a navy blazer and 2 high heels approached us with a practiced smile. Her hair twisted into one of those low buns that look simple and take 3 YouTube videos to learn. "Mrs. Lawson?" she asked, extending her hand, and I appreciated that she didn't go straight for my first name like we were girlfriends. "I'm Jenna. I'll be helping you and your son today." Her handshake was firm, her palm warm. "If you'll come with me, we'll get started." Her office was small but bright, with one wall entirely glass looking out over the lobby, so our conversation felt both private and on display, a strange duality. There was a framed print of a tree on one wall, its branches turning into $signs if you looked long enough, and on her desk, beside the computer monitor, a little digital clock glowed green numbers, ticking the seconds in silent competition with the old one at home. She made small talk at first, asking about my day, about the funeral in a gentle tone that suggested she had done this before, many times, and I watched her eyes flick to my folder as if it were a puzzle she was eager to solve. "We're mostly here to make sure my mom doesn't miss anything important," Mark said, settling into the chair beside me like this was just another consult, not a rearrangement of my autonomy. "And to see if there's a way to simplify her accounts. She's been handling everything, but with Dad gone." He trailed off, and his hand twitched toward mine, almost touching, then stopped, hovering in the space between us. Jenna nodded sympathetically. "I'm very sorry for your loss," she said, and then, gently, "a lot of people find that after a big life change, it helps to think of their finances like a kitchen pantry. Over time, things get shoved in the back, there are duplicates, expired cans, and it can feel overwhelming. What we'll do today is pull everything out, see what you have, and decide what to keep front and center so it's easier to find what you need." She slid a legal pad toward me, not toward Mark, and I liked her a little for that. Nothing changes without your say-so, Mrs. Lawson. I'm here to give you options, not orders. I glanced at Mark and saw him relax slightly, his shoulders dropping an inch. The metaphor wasn't terrible, I thought. I understood pantries. I'd lived my life making meals from whatever we had on hand. All right, I said. Let's see what's in the back of my shelves. We went through the accounts one by one, the checking and the little savings account Tom and I had started when the kids were small, the one we'd once called the vacation jar before vacations turned into fixing roofs and replacing tires. There was the small life insurance policy from the factory, not much, but enough to cover the funeral and maybe a bit more, and Jenna explained, in that careful, metaphor-laced way of hers, how we could relabel certain funds so they'd be easier to access. When she suggested putting Mark's name on one of the accounts just for ease, like giving him a spare key so he can grab something off the top shelf if you can't reach, my fingers closed reflexively around the keys in my pocket, the real metal digging into my palm. A spare key is still my key, I said slowly. It means you can help me get what I need when I ask. It doesn't mean you can redecorate my kitchen while I'm sleeping. Jenna's eyes softened. Exactly, she said. This would just allow your son to help pay a bill if you were in the hospital or something. You'd both still be on the account. It's very common. Mark looked at me, hopeful, like a boy asking for the car keys for the first time, and I thought about the stories Margaret had told me over the years, about friends whose children had helped with finances until the house wasn't theirs anymore, until they were visitors in the life they'd built. Those children hadn't been monsters, just human beings under stress, making choices they justified as practical. Let's start small, I said finally. You can add Mark to the checking account for emergencies. That's it for now. No more keys until I see how this feels. Mark opened his mouth, probably to argue for the savings too, but my face must have shown him something because he closed it again and nodded, and the relief that flickered through me surprised me. It felt good to have drawn a line, even a thin one, and to see it respected. While Jenna typed and shuffled papers, I let my gaze drift to her little digital clock, its seconds flashing away in silent green pulses, so different from my clock's gentle pendulum swing, and I thought about the difference between counting time and keeping it, between being measured by someone else's device and listening to your own. The signing itself was anticlimactic, just a couple of lines at the bottom of forms that all looked the same. My name written in the rounded script I'd had since high school, and when it was done, Jenna leaned back and said, "There's one more thing I'd recommend you at least think about in the coming months. It's something called a durable power of attorney. It's like, imagine you have a really important recipe, and for some reason, someday, you can't quite remember all the steps. A power of attorney lets you choose someone to hold the recipe card for you and stir the pot if you can't. They don't own the kitchen, but they can keep dinner from burning." She glanced between us. "It can be a great safety net." The words, "someday," and "can't quite remember," made the air feel thinner. I thought of Lisa's remark about forgetting where I put the papers, of the way my children had already begun talking around me instead of to me. My spine chilled despite the heat of the stuffy little office. And if the person holding the card decides they prefer takeout? I asked lightly, though my lips felt stiff. Jenna's smile faltered for just a heartbeat, then returned. That's why you choose someone you trust, she said. Someone who understands this is about what you would want, not what's easiest for them. Mark cleared his throat, and I saw his hand curl slightly on his knee, his wedding ring catching the fluorescent light. It's a conversation for another time, he said quickly, and I could tell he was thinking of Lisa, of late nights and budget spreadsheets and the weight of being the eldest, the nearby one. We don't need to decide that today. He glanced at me as if seeking approval. We really don't, I agreed, and the relief I felt was mixed with something else, a quiet alarm that this topic had even been introduced so early, as if the world had already decided my mind was a bowl likely to tip. When we left the bank, the sun was bright but the wind still had teeth, and as we walked to the truck, my eyes watered in the cold, blurring the lines of the parking lot and the cars into streaks of color. Mark misread it as emotion, I think, because he put an arm around my shoulders and squeezed. That wasn't so bad, right? He said, helping me up into the passenger seat like he'd helped patients into wheelchairs. We're just setting things up so you don't have to worry. It's like putting rails on a staircase before someone falls. I tilted my head, considering. Rails can keep someone safe, I said, buckling my seatbelt, or they can make someone feel like everyone expects them to fall. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, starting the truck with a sigh. You're allowed to be mad at me, you know, he muttered as we pulled out of the lot. I can't handle the thought of you alone in that house if something happens. I watched the town slide past the window, the familiar brick storefronts and the church steeple, and the diner where Tom and I used to get pie on Thursdays, all of it looking both exactly the same and slightly off-kilter. Then come by more, I said quietly. Bring the kids on a Sunday. Call me on your lunch break. Don't just show up with forms. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It felt like standing in a doorway, not sure whether to go in or out. That night, after Mark had dropped me off with a plastic folder of summary documents and a bright pamphlet about planning for the next chapter that I left face down on the hall table under the key dish, and after I'd microwaved leftover casserole and eaten it. Mechanically in front of the local news, my phone lit up with a FaceTime call from Emily. Her face filled the screen, framed by a sleek bob and the exposed brick wall of her Chicago apartment behind her, and I could see the flicker of moving lights in the reflection of her window. Cars on the street, a city that never quite sleeps. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice a little too cheerful, the way people sound when they're stepping carefully on ice. "How are you?" I could see her eyes scanning my background, taking in the living room, the clock behind me, my cardigan. "You look good. Tired, but good." "I look like a woman who buried her husband 3 days ago," I said, not unkindly. "How was your conference?" The word came out sharper than I intended, carrying all the images I'd conjured of hotel bars and name tags and clinking glasses. Emily flinched, a tiny tightening around her mouth. "Work was intense," she said. "We closed a huge deal. My boss said it was career-defining. I really did mean to leave early for the funeral, Mom. And then everything shifted, and there were flights canceled, and—" "I don't want to talk about canceled flights," I interrupted. I want to know how you are." She blinked, caught off guard, then exhaled slowly. "I'm compartmentalizing," she admitted, a phrase I recognized from her therapy talk. "If I let myself think too much about Dad being gone, I'm afraid I won't get out of bed, so I'm staying in motion, you know?" I watched her, my girl, my not girl, the child who used to bury her face in my shoulder when she'd skinned her knee, now hiding behind terms and strategies. "I know," I said softly. "But motion isn't the same as being present. It's like pacing in a room with no windows." She glanced away for a second, her jaw working. "Mark told me he took you to the bank," she said, changing the subject with the smoothness of someone used to steering conversations. "That's good. I was worried you'd resist getting everything organized. We should probably talk soon about the house, too. You don't have to decide right now, obviously, but it's a lot, Mom. For you. And for later. It might make sense to put things in a trust or something so there aren't any surprises with taxes and probate and all that. My friend in corporate had to deal with her grandma's estate, and it was a nightmare." I felt my back stiffen. There it was again, the house, not as home, but as a problem to be solved. "Funny," I said slowly, "how the word estate makes this 50-year-old place with its leaky basement sound like a mansion in a movie." Emily laughed, a little forced. "Legal language is ridiculous," she agreed. "But seriously, Mom, we just want to make sure everything is clean and fair for you and for us. Dad always said he didn't want us fighting over anything when this day came." Tom had said that. At the kitchen table once, years ago, when we updated our will after his first health scare. But he'd said it while looking at me, his hand over mine, not while flipping through property law articles. "Your father also said he wanted me to be able to stay in this house as long as I felt up to it," I replied. "That's in there somewhere, too." Emily nodded slowly. "Right," she said. "Of course, we're not trying to push you out. I see clients all the time, women in their 60s and 70s who get overwhelmed because their husbands handled everything, and then suddenly they're drowning in forms. I don't want that for you." "Your father did handle a lot," I admitted. "More than I realized, maybe. But I can swim." I glanced at the clock. Its hands pointed to 9:30. The tick, tick, tick was clear through the phone's microphone, and Emily's eyes flicked toward the sound. "Wow, you still have that thing," she said, a little smile crossing her face. "That clock used to freak me out when I was a teenager, remember? I'd sneak in past curfew, and it was like it was judging me, counting every second I was late." "It wasn't judging," I said. "It was just telling the truth." She looked back at me, something softening. "You know I love you, right?" she asked suddenly, the words naked, unadorned by disclaimers. "Even if I'm not there, I'll come visit soon, once things calm down at work, and we'll sit under that clock and go through everything together, okay?" "Okay," I said, though I didn't know if it was. After we said our good nights, I put the phone down and leaned my head back against Tom's chair, letting the sound of the clock wash over me. The house felt full and empty at the same time, full of echoes and empty of footsteps. And I thought of all the professionals who would soon be folded into our lives, bankers, lawyers, maybe social workers if Mark had his way, and how each of them would bring their metaphors and explanations, their ways of making losing something sound like gaining peace of mind. That thought carried me, like a slow current, toward Tom's old desk in the corner of the room, the one I'd hardly touched since he went into the hospital. It sat there like a dark, solid promise, its drawers holding who knew what. Receipts, letters, maybe some answers, maybe just more questions. I stood up, joints protesting, and went to it, the floorboards creaking familiarly under my feet. The desk drawer handles were smooth from years of use, cool under my fingers, and when I pulled the top one open, the smell of old paper and pencil shavings rose up, a little ghost of our earlier lives. Inside, everything was as meticulously organized as ever. Paper clips in a small tin, pens in a row, a stack of envelopes, a rubber-banded bundle of index cards. Underneath those, I found his ledger, the one he'd kept since we first bought this house, a neat record of every major expense, written in that same careful block printing, and beside it, a thin folder labeled House in his hand. My fingers trembled a little as I opened it, the clock ticking steadily behind me, and inside I found what you'd expect: copies of the deed, insurance documents, a home equity line we'd opened once to pay for Emily's tuition and then closed, all of it dry and official, but tucked at the back, almost as an afterthought, was a single sheet of lined notebook paper, folded in half, the edges soft from handling. My name was written on the outside. Ellen. Nothing else. For a second, the room narrowed to just that word. I sat down in his desk chair, still slightly molded to his shoulders, and unfolded the paper carefully, like it might tear if I rushed. The writing inside was less precise than in the ledger, the letters a little shakier. A date in the corner told me he'd written it 6 months before he died, not long after his diagnosis. L, it began, and I heard his voice in my head, tired but trying to be steady. If you're reading this, it probably means I didn't get around to saying everything I meant to, or you didn't listen because you were too busy fussing over me, which is also likely. I could almost see the little smile he'd have had writing that. The letter wasn't long, a few paragraphs covering practical things in his plain, unsentimental way. Reminders about where he'd kept certain documents, admissions about a small term policy he'd bought without telling me because he didn't want to jinx it. And then, near the bottom, a couple of lines that made my chest tight. The house, he'd written, I know the kids will have opinions, capital O. You're the one who has to live with the consequences, not them. I told Mark I'd rather see you fall asleep in that old chair under the clock than sitting up straight in some lobby waiting for your name to be called. If at some point you want to sell, fine. See the lawyer we used for the will. She's straight with people. But don't let anyone rush you out. This place is more than drywall. It's you. At the very end, he'd added, almost as a postscript, if they start talking about protecting your assets like you're a jar on a shelf, remember, you protected them long before they knew what that word meant. My eyes blurred, the words swimming, and I realized I'd been holding my breath again. The clock ticked behind me, its sound suddenly louder than before, filling the room. I sat there for a long time, the letter open on my lap, my fingers tracing his scrawled L, until eventually the ache in my neck forced me to move. Carefully, I refolded the paper along its original creases and slipped it back into its folder, but not into the same place. It went instead into my own folder, the one with the bank documents and funeral bill, under the section I'd mentally labeled mine, not ours or the kids. Then, after a moment's thought, I reached for a yellow sticky note and a pen and wrote down the name of the lawyer Tom had mentioned, the one who'd handled our will years ago, the letters of her name coming back to me like a song's chorus. I stuck the note on the inside of the desk drawer, then hesitated, peeled it off, and walked over to the living room archway where I could see the clock's face clearly. The hands now pointed to 10:15. The pendulum swung steadily. On the wall beside the clock, there was a little sliver of empty space where a calendar had hung once, before we switched to keeping track of things on phones. It looked bare now, like it was waiting. I pressed the sticky note there instead. Right under the clock, the bright yellow square, a small defiant flag. As I smoothed it with my fingers, the paper crinkled slightly, and I thought of Mark and Emily, of their brochures and metaphors and fear disguised as practicality, and of the letter in my folder with Tom's shaky assurance that this house was me. My hand drifted to my pocket, to the spare key resting there, and I closed my fingers around it, feeling the indentations press into my skin, a map I knew by heart. I didn't have a plan, not really, not yet, but as I stood in the dim light of my living room, with the clock ticking above my head and the lawyer's name written on the wall beside it, I felt that small, stubborn voice inside me clear its throat, no longer content to whisper. I knew that voice would have to be quiet, for now, careful, because love and obligation and fear make a tangled knot, and pulling too hard on one strand can tighten all the others, but still, tomorrow or the day after, I would call that number. I wouldn't tell Mark or Emily, not at first. I would sit across from someone whose job it was to see the papers as shields instead of weapons, and I would ask my own questions, not just answer theirs. For tonight, though, I turned back toward the hallway, the pendulum swing at my back like a heartbeat, and as I walked past the front door, I saw, resting in the little dish on the table, my house key catching the lamplight, a small, ordinary piece of metal that suddenly felt like the heaviest thing I owned. I woke before the sun, the house still holding the last bit of night, as if it didn't want to let it go, the quiet so complete that for a moment I thought the clock had stopped, but then I heard it, soft, steady, stubborn, tick, 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 from the living room, and I lay there with my hand resting on the spare key under my pillow, the one I'd tucked there last night, without thinking, the metal warming against my palm like a promise. The bank papers were still spread across the kitchen table from the night before, alongside Tom's letter and that yellow sticky note with the lawyer's name taped beneath the clock, and I realized as I sat up slowly, the cold floor biting at my feet, that something had shifted overnight, not dramatically, not like some big revelation, but like a small beam settling into place in a house that's been carrying too much weight. I made coffee, the smell filling the kitchen in that comforting way that always makes me feel like I'm not entirely alone in the mornings, and I stood by the window watching the pale Ohio dawn arrive in thin stripes of light across the yard, the maple tree catching the first hints of pink at the tips of its bare branches. And I felt that same quiet certainty I'd felt last night when I'd put the sticky note by the clock, that whatever happened next, and however much the kids might press or plan or gently bulldoze, I needed at least one decision to be mine alone. By 9, the house felt restless, as if the walls themselves needed me to do something with all this clarity. So I dressed slowly, Choosing the navy sweater Tom always said made my eyes look less tired, and when I stepped into the hallway, the key in the dish glinted at me like an invitation, but instead of picking it up, I touched the spare key in my pocket, the one that felt like it belonged to me rather than to the routines of family expectation, and I walked into the living room, phone in hand, standing directly in front of the clock, as if its steady ticking might lend me some of its resolve. I dialed the lawyer, Miss Harrigan, her name was, and when she answered, her voice warm and unhurried, I felt something unclench inside me, and after the initial pleasantries, I told her who I was and that I wanted to come in, alone, to review the house papers, the will, everything, not because there was a crisis, but because I needed clarity on what choices were truly mine. She said she remembered Tom, remembered how particular he'd been about the language in the will, and she said, "Take your time explaining what you need, Mrs. Lawson. We'll make sure you're standing on your own feet here." And her voice, so calmly competent, settled something in me. We set an appointment for the next morning. When I hung up, I stood there listening to the clock for a long time, letting the sound fill the room until it felt like the beating of my own heart. Later, when Mark called, right as I was slicing an apple for lunch, and launched straight into updates about the plans he and Emily had been discussing, the pathways and options and safety nets, something inside me finally rose to the surface. Not angry, not brittle, but firm in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Mark," I said gently, cutting through his nervous monologue, "I've already made an appointment with the lawyer, by myself, tomorrow morning." There was a long pause, long enough that I could hear him breathing. "Why didn't you tell me first?" he asked, sounding younger than he had in decades. "Because I needed one step that didn't have anyone else's fingerprints on it," I said. "Your father left me a note. He said not to let anyone hurry me out of the life I built. I need to understand my options before I let anyone else explain them to me." He exhaled shakily, the hurt and relief mixed together. "Mom, are you doing this because you don't trust us?" "No," I said, pressing my thumb against the cool apple slice, watching the juice glisten on its edge. "I'm doing this so I can trust myself again." He didn't speak at first, and when he did, his voice was thick but quiet. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, Mom, I'll back off a bit. Just tell me what you need." After we hung up, I realized my hands weren't trembling. That felt like its own kind of milestone. The next morning at the lawyer's office, the sunlight fell in long yellow rectangles across her desk, illuminating the stacks of papers she'd set out in tidy piles. She wasn't rushed, didn't talk to me like I was fragile, and when she explained the legal options, trusts, beneficiary deeds, life estates, she did so in a way that made sense, saying, "Think of this like arranging your pantry after a lifetime of cooking. You know where everything goes. I'm just helping you label the jars so no one else can move them without your say-so." And I felt something inside me settle even deeper than before. She asked careful questions about what I wanted for the house, for the land, for my future. And I heard myself speak truths I hadn't admitted even in my own mind, that I wasn't ready to leave, that I wasn't done living in the home I'd built with Tom, that I wanted to remain in control of my life, not be shielded from it. When I left her office, stepping into the bright, cold afternoon, I felt more grounded than I had since before the funeral. I came home to the living room quiet except for the clock. its pendulum glinting in a beam of sunlight, and for the first time since Tom died, I sat on the floor in front of it, leaning my back against the chair he loved, letting the sound wash over me. That night, I called both kids at once, speakerphone, a first for us, and told them calmly, kindly, that I wasn't selling the house. Not now, maybe not ever. That I'd be putting protections in place for myself rather than for their convenience. That I loved them, but also needed them to let me live, not fold me into their schedules like a task. There was some fumbling, some apologies, some defensiveness, but also something else, something like respect, trying to learn how to stand upright again. After the call, I put the phone down, walked to the front hall, and picked up the house key from the ceramic dish. For the first time in weeks, I held it without dread. I turned it over, the brass warm now from the lamplight, and slipped it into my pocket beside the spare one. 2 keys. 2 parts of my life, no longer divided between fear and obligation, but carried together. When I walked back into the living room, the clock ticked steadily, unbothered by anything except the truth of passing time, and I whispered into the quiet room, "Okay, Tom. I'm finding my way." And for a moment, the pendulum catch of its swing sounded almost like an answer. And now, if this story felt like yours in any corner of your heart, if some part of you heard yourself in my hesitation, my quietness, my shrinking in my own home, I want to tell you something gently and honestly. You're not strange or weak for feeling that way. Sometimes love gets tangled with fear and expectation, and the people we raised forget to look closely enough to see we're still standing. And if you found yourself leaning in at certain moments, if you've ever felt talked over, nudged aside, or folded into someone else's plan without being asked, then hear this softly. You don't have to push anyone away to take up your own space again. You only need one small act of truth, one step toward your own voice, the way I reached for my keys and chose where to stand. Your life is still yours, even if others sometimes forget it. And if you're standing at the edge of a room in your own home, wondering whether you're allowed to claim even a small corner of it, start there. Sit where your heart breathes easiest. Touch the object that has always felt like yours, whether it's a clock, a lamp, a chair, or a single key. Then make one choice, however small, that belongs only to you. The rest can follow in time, steady as the swing of a pendulum. Did you like the story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.